Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 4, Dragon Chapters 5 and 6. Izuku sat on his bed and took a couple of deep breaths. It was nice to just be able to sit and think by himself for once. The last few weeks had been so hectic that he'd always just fallen to sleep for as long as he could get. It was nice now to have some space to call his own and to actually go through the routine of getting ready to sleep. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed that. It gave him time to reflect. Things were going. In one way they were going well. He hadn't been captured. The majority of Tomura's crew had agreed to follow him and he was working on a plan. In another way, it was going terribly. He'd killed Tomura, mucking up his dad's chances of being healed. He didn't have a solid plan or anything resembling that, and he swallowed hard and shoved the thought that he'd failed his dad from his mind. There would be another way. There had to be another way. He'd just have to find it. There was time. He couldn't expect anything to be done in a month. He'd have to take the time to build the support he'd need to maintain control of society, and there were so many problems. He hadn't discussed it with his crew, but it would be a lot easier if his dad was free. Then, Izuku sighed. He'd be in a subordinate position, but that wouldn't be too bad. His dad knew the entire plan and for the moment, he couldn't think like that. He had to lead. Though he didn't have a definite plan. Even so, he could work with that. No matter what he wanted to do eventually, he was going to need more manpower, so that had to be his first goal. Then he could work on other plans and maybe someone would have some suggestions. Though he was a little disappointed in those who had been gathered for Tomura. When he'd mentioned thinking about a quirk to counter their weaknesses, he'd been hoping someone would have realized that support equipment could also help. But no one had suggested it. He thought about that for a moment. Maybe their weaknesses weren't something that could be effectively handled by support equipment. He should check, because even if they couldn't counter a weakness that way, support equipment was effective for other things. It was support after all. He took off his shirt, and the light vest, folding it carefully. Just seeing it reminded him about May and the fact he was going to have to be careful with it. Or get someone else to build another. Izuku sighed. He'd have to talk to them about that. He blinked and reveled in the fact that while his eyelids were heavy, it wasn't the exhaustion he'd felt the last few days. It was just the usual tiredness at the end of the day. That felt nice, and with a smile, Izuku lay down and pulled the covers over him. One thing his dad had never said but was obvious in hindsight: what the world called villainy took just as much work as heroics. He needed his rest. Dabi had to admit that being out of the warehouse was nice. If it got him revenge on Endeavor, he'd have stayed there, but it was better here. Plus, the Warper had somehow got the bar stocked, and that helped. The 5 of them were gathered at one of the booths. They'd been spread out earlier, but when some of the locals had wandered in, the Warper had shooed them to the side. Paying customers took precedence over them apparently. So now that the boss has gone to bed, we should have some adult talk, he laughed. What, you gonna tell us you're still a virgin, Crispy? Dabi reminded himself that while he'd lived with these guys for the last few weeks, he hadn't really had to interact with them. And now that Dragon had given back Shouto's quirk, he could just walk away, but that was... The underworld ran on the strength of people's word. And while there were times when you could get away with breaking it, he already knew now was not going to be one of those times. He'd have to learn to deal with this one. Like you are, Aya? He returned, lazily picking up his beer. She chuckled. Oh, is that short for vampire? The blood freak cooed. Irritation, Dabi corrected. She snorted and then gave him a direct look up and down. Yeah, you just wish you could get some, she murmured. The others were rather conspicuous in their silence, but he figured they didn't want to get involved. Come on, he challenged. It's obvious you are saving yourself for the kid. Dabi told her. When the fuck were you born? The Taisho era? She snapped back. Girls do that sort of romantic shit all the time, he countered and then dodged. Where did she keep those throwing knives? A hunting knife appeared in her hand and she slid out of the bench seat she had been on. Dabi got up, dodging the slash she made. You listen here, crispy critter. The blonde hissed. If I sleep with Izu, I will fuck his brains so good. You on the other hand. Ha! You couldn't pay me enough. He gave her a look. The blonde rolled her eyes. Little boys do such stupid things all for someone to wriggle around for them. She dismissed his suggestion. Why don't you both calm down? One of the others asked. Dabby thought it was Compress. He seemed level-headed. Just as soon as Crispy gets his head out of the Meiji era. She hissed in reply. Dabby saw the way Whisper rubbed her temple. We are a long way past the Taisho and Meiji era, the woman pointed out. Is not. The snap was petulant. We are, Compress said. And we are worrying the patrons. She huffed and the hunting knife disappeared before the blonde slid back into the bench seat. It would be a bitch to have to move again. He'd done it before. There'd been times when he'd had to move every few hours, 'cause heroes were after him, but that hadn't happened for a while and he didn't like how reactive that made him. He was better than that. He planned. Dabby gave the blonde a careful look before returning to his seat. So you are more experienced than you look. He murmured. It's just sex. She muttered. Do you think the kid is? Dabby put the question to the table. Think the kid is what? Twice asked with a note of exaggerated innocence. Whisper just sighed. Ah, forget it then, Dabby sighed. Compress gave him a measuring look. Why did you bring it up? The question caught him by surprise. Why had he brought it up? He didn't mean anything serious by it and it was. Forget it, he repeated and picked up his beer to avoid saying anything more. He was kind of thankful when the others shrugged. What do you think Dragon's first mission will be? Whisper asked to change the subject. I don't know. I do know, Twice answered. It will be something good. The blonde said chirpily. He's going to wait for some fallout first, Dabby answered, after swallowing his beer. Compress gave him another look, this time inviting him to say something more. Part of what I wanted, Dabby told them. It was enough for the magician to understand. I expect he will meet with the Yakuza before doing anything major. Compress said. The extra manpower will help. Twice nodded and then shook his head. Was he serious about? He paused. About? Whisper prompted. He was serious, Himiko said. How do you know? Dabby asked. Because Hanzi once asked me. She snapped back. It wasn't the answer any of them expected. If you can think of a quirk that will help with a weakness, he can give it to you, Himiko continued. Dabby watched as expressions became more thoughtful. He already knew what would help him but he had no idea what might help the others. They were silent as they thought. It's not like we have to accept immediately, Dabby told them. Whisper nodded slowly. How long do you think it will take you to contact the Yakuza? She asked Twice. Not long, forever. He replied before shaking his head. It will depend on if they want to meet, he added. Has anyone dealt with them? There were headshakes all around. They generally stick to themselves, Himiko commented. And they are all sick. Dabby couldn't help the incredulous look he gave her. He wasn't the only one. The blonde huffed as if she knew what they were thinking and then pouted. Meanies, she muttered. They stick to themselves? Whisper asked. Usually, Twice told them. But I'll see what they say. Compress nodded. We have a lot to think about, and we'll just have to find out what the boss says, he said. It was a conclusion and Dabby was kind of thankful when the others nodded and took it as such. And it wasn't untrue. There was a lot to think about. If the kid could get them quirks to counter their weaknesses then. While it would mean admitting to those weaknesses, it would give them a huge advantage. He could almost imagine the fight with Endeavor if he had something to regulate temperature. Dabby dragged himself out of that contemplation. It was nice but now was not the time and there was a lot of work to go before he could go to that battle, and the kid had said he'd work Endeavor into his plans. But he'd also admitted that he'd want to consult with them on those plans to make them better. But that suggested an opening to him. If he went to the kid with a plan. Dabby smiled to himself. If he went to the kid with a plan, there was every chance the kid would go for it. He might get Endeavor sooner rather than later and that. Yeah, he'd enjoy that. So why did you ask? Compress questioned. Dabby looked around. He didn't realize the others had left. Ask what? The magician had taken off his mask and top hat and raised one eyebrow at him. Dabby huffed. A stupid joke, he told the other man. He didn't look convinced. Female chastity and virginity has not been an issue for quite some time. I know that, Dabby snapped. No one liked to call them wars, but the wars that occurred when quirks first emerged, and the social upheaval they caused, allowed for quite a few social issues to be ignored. You sure? Compress said, but his expression said he was thinking of something else. Just a stupid joke, Dabi repeated. We are going to be building up Dragon's reputation, he said, trying to change the subject, but he had a feeling Compress knew that while the wars had removed the old social stigmas, in old-fashioned households, some of the older values were still adhered to. He cursed Endeavor again. He thought he'd cast away everything from then, but the man, his views, his arg. He kept coming back to haunt him. Compress nodded but knew there was more to come. It really was just a joke, he said again. While we build up Dragon's reputation, I thought it could be fun if we found things to make the kid blush. Sex seemed like a good choice. For a moment it seemed as if Compress would just dismiss the matter. I'm not sure Dragon would think it's funny. I wasn't planning on telling him, Dabi grumbled. Compress shook his head and Dabi got the impression that he didn't approve. It's on your head, he said finally. It's just some fun. He shook his head again and got up to leave Dabi alone at the table. The empty beer glasses were clustered together as if gathered for some funeral. He snarled. He knew why he'd brought it up. But no. He was not going to think that. It wasn't that. It was just a bit of pointless fun. It meant nothing else. Dabi drained the last of his beer and slammed his pint down. It didn't mean anything. Izuku jerked awake and sat bolt upright. He felt his heartbeat slow, and the sweat on his body cool and dry. He was warm enough. The blankets were more than sufficient to ward off any cold from the air, but why had he woken up? A dream. He didn't dream that often. Well, Izuku figured he dreamed as much as everyone else, but he didn't often remember his dreams. This one was a bit weird and particularly vivid. He wasn't sure where, and Izuku smiled ironically to himself. Maybe the dream hadn't been as vivid as he thought, but there were bits that stood out to him. Even now, wherever he had been, he didn't recognize it. It kept changing. At one point it was a forest, with huge trees reaching for the sky, then it had changed and the trees were all saplings before they vanished altogether and he appeared to be in a cave. That wasn't the important bit though. No matter where he was, he'd been surrounded by bodies. Some of them had ripped and bloody clothing and others were fine. He couldn't see any injuries, but he hadn't really looked. The most disconcerting part of it was that in the distance he could see a table. It was set out as if for tea. There were cups, teapots and tiered trays of food. For all the formality of the table, the places were mostly taken by children. They had no idea what to do. The bodies went all the way up to the table and it was actually on a pile of them, but the people weren't paying any attention to the bodies. It was like they couldn't see them. The children were squirming in their seats, but they weren't running off to play. There were some adults at the table. He recognized one of them. It was Seisho Kijo. At least he thought it was. The formal kimono was the same, but her hair was no longer white, but black and bundled on the top of her head in a complicated arrangement. She was much younger here, but it was Seisho, he knew it. She was chatting with another man and woman who Izuku did not recognize at all. The woman had fiery red hair and bright eyes. The man had black hair and a thin, wiry appearance. They were all sipping at their tea, and occasionally reaching out to save one of the biscuits from being thrown off the table. They interacted with the children but didn't seem too concerned by them, and like the children, they didn't seem to notice the bodies. Instead, they were relaxed and happy. He'd just watched for a while, not understanding what was going on, before he'd noticed that there was another place set at the table. The plates were laid out, along with the teacup, but it was empty. Izuku wondered about that, and then as he watched, he saw something move in the distance. It wasn't much. Just the impression of movement until a semicircle behind the table changed. At first, it was just a line, and then that line grew. Izuku noticed it because it was a brilliant green against the black shadows of the background. Slowly it became larger until Izuku realized with a shock that he was looking at a giant eyeball. It opened just a crack and then he woke up. He took a deep breath. His heartbeat was back to normal now, and when he thought about it, he had no idea what he was afraid of. No, he did. Anything with an eyeball that large was. Except the people at the table hadn't seemed concerned. And they hadn't noticed the bodies and... It's just a dream, he murmured, shaking his head. Yes, he'd seen Psycho there, but that didn't mean much. He hadn't thought about her for a while and... Actually, he had no idea if she was even still alive. Izuku reached out and grabbed his phone from the floor. The place Kurogiri had found for them was light on furniture, but the bed was soft and warm, so that was good enough. He tapped the screen and squinted at the blue light. It resolved into a screen and he tapped to go to the official births, deaths and marriages registry. The records had been digital for years. He typed in the name Psycho Kijo and hit search. There were several hits and Izuku wondered how he could sort them out. Things like birth date weren't mentioned to protect against identity theft. How did he figure out which psycho was the one he wanted? Well, he didn't want marriage or birth notices, so that was one way, and Izuku quickly filtered the results to exclude them, which thankfully removed some of the names. But there were still others. He sighed and put his phone down. The easiest way to find out if she was still alive would be to ask Giran. But Izuku didn't think she would be. She'd been 93 when he'd met her, and that was 7 years ago. But he wanted to visit her grave and say thank you again. After today's dream, it just seemed right. Captain Takeo Meishu looked at the stats for her district. They'd had a spate of gun violence in her district lately. It had been against the homeless, and in all cases, the witnesses had indicated that the perpetrators had worn plague masks. Of all things, she'd dismissed it at first, but when the second, third, and fourth reports had come in, she couldn't just call it a hallucination from whatever drugs they were on. She sighed. Someone was targeting the homeless. And it probably wasn't just one person. The plague mask had been present at each attack, but it was described differently each time. Sometimes it was black. Sometimes it was white or brown. It didn't always cover their eyes. So there was definitely more than one. Which meant there was an organization. They weren't killing him though. The shots were very careful to be in the arm or leg. Nothing that was fatal, and then this is where the stories got even more ridiculous. Those who were shot claimed that their quirk was gone. Except they weren't. When they were asked to demonstrate their quirk, it worked, so Meishu would like to say there was nothing more to consider, but there had been several whose quirk hadn't worked. It had later, but not when they were first asked. The general feedback from the medics was that the gunshot had stressed the individual, and they'd temporarily suppressed their quirk. The medics who examined the wounds and patched them up had also said that they weren't regular bullet wounds. In fact, one of them had said the wound was more similar to that of a tranquilizer dart, but not quite. There had been some foreign but still organic substance in the wound, but no one could tell what it was, and for the moment, since it was only the homeless being attacked, there hadn't been the motivation to do a full analysis of it. They'd just run the general tests. Meishu had no idea what was going on. The police were meant to deal with criminals, and it was meant to be pretty straightforward. Villains were dealt with by heroes, and they were the ones who could have the headaches. This was a headache. This wasn't straightforward, and it was annoying her. "Sir, what is it?" Takeo snapped, looking up from the reports. "We've got eyes on someone with a plague mask," Kepu told her. "Where?" "Inadera Avenue," came the quick reply. "Shit." Takeo swore. Inadera Avenue was near the Zambori River, and the homeless generally gathered under the bridges. It was an easy way of keeping the worst of the weather off them, and if they could rig up some sort of windbreak. "Here," Kepu said, holding out a radio. It was kind of archaic that they still used radios, but it was the most efficient form of comms. The phone networks were stable but could be overwhelmed at times of the day or year, so they needed the reliability. "Who is it?" Captain Meishu asked. "Isatsu," Kepu told her. "Isatsu," Takeo snapped. "Sir, just follow them," she ordered. She had a suspicion about where the plague-masked group was living, but she needed it confirmed. Then she could order a raid. They were Yakuza, an organization that should have been dead and buried but had persisted, tenuously clinging to life like a cockroach. They'd been all but obliterated in the late 20th century, but their descendants had turned to cybercrime in an ever-dwindling state until the dawn of quirks. The social upheaval then should have been the final death knell for them, but they had clung on and even created some clan-like structures in places. It was hard to tell with the wars and fighting, but they'd probably helped some people during those times. Society then wasn't what it was today, but they had long survived past the time where they were useful. Nowadays, as far as she knew, they took in outcasts, and Meishu had no real idea as to what they did. Probably petty organized crime and drug distribution. She'd never caught them at anything, so it was time that they were reminded who was in charge. To do that, she'd need some proof for a warrant. Shit. They've just shot someone. Isatsu whispered urgently. Call an ambulance and continue tracking them, Takeo instructed. But they shot them in the leg, yes? She asked pointedly. There was silence and she could imagine that Isatsu was checking. Yes, sir, came the reluctant response. Then this is like the others, Takeo concluded. The person would be injured but would be okay after being treated for the wound. Call an ambulance, she ordered again. I want to know where the plague masks are hiding. Yes, sir, Isatsu agreed. Meishu brought up a map and tapped her finger on an area of it. It was a residential area but the buildings were large and Yakuza tended to inherit their wealth, though the years of being ostracized had to be cutting into those funds. She just knew they were there. The evidence would come. When Yakuni had agreed to help the Shi Hasaikai, he'd been given better facilities to help them, but he was still viewed with suspicion and in charge of the girl. He could eat with the rest of the group and did, but he could sense there was still a division. He wasn't sure if it was because they still suspected him. He didn't think it was. If that was the case, then he was sure Kai would take him apart again. It was probably because he was different, and involved in the core plan. Though if it was suspicion, it wasn't unfounded. He wasn't loyal to them. He said he was, but he was, as always, loyal to Dragon. They'd asked if he was still loyal to Dragon's father, and that had never been the case. Not his first loyalty anyway. Oh, it had been, but it had changed. What you doing, Yuki Niai? Yakuni looked over to the child the Shi Hisaskai were dependent on and gave her a smile. I'm looking at a slide, he told her. Do you want to see? He offered. She looked hopeful and he slid off the chair he was sitting on, gesturing for her to get up on it. Her name was Eri, and without her, he knew Overhaul's plans were nothing. She climbed up and looked through the microscope. It's all blue. Eri exclaimed. That's the dye, Yakuni replied. You used dye to highlight certain cells, and he was looking at hers. Yuki Niai, what is this? Eri asked. It's your quirk factor, he told her. She could say his name, but since he'd become her quasi-protector, she'd chosen to call him that. It was probably because he was just as trapped as she was, and she knew it. My quirk factor? An extract of it, he explained. He had to admit that Kai was intelligent. At least in a way. The man didn't have a scientific background. He was a thug, but through trial and error he'd figured out most of what he needed. The Shi Hasaikai were not powerful, but with his plan, they could be. Kai had managed quite a lot on his own, but Yakuni knew he'd accelerated the process slightly. The Shi Hasaikai could isolate Eri's quirk factor, but he'd refined the process so that they got more for the same sample size when they harvested from her. He'd also refined their concentration technique, and Kai had mostly worked out the difficult part of his plan. Eri's quirk rewound things, but it didn't stop. She could stop it, but when they made the extract it didn't stop. Kai had worked out, at least in theory, how to adjust the potency so it stopped and only affected the subject's quirk. He'd been impressed by that, but what he was looking for now was a complete inhibitor. Yakuni wasn't stupid. He knew that Dragon and Dragon's dad were considered a threat to Kai, and that the Yakuza would want to use a quirk erasure bullet on them. Maybe not Dragon's dad now, since he was in Tartarus, but Dragon. That made him feel sick, which was why he was working on this. If there was a way of stopping Eri's quirk at a particular point, then why not shift the point so that it never started working? At least, that was the theory. And if he couldn't do that, then he didn't think he could do it quickly, and Yakuni wasn't sure if it was even possible, but he was then going to try to reverse Eri's quirk. Theoretically, if he could see how it worked, he could reverse it, but that was a big, big theory. He wasn't as good at this as Daruma. Yakuni knew his best hope was to find a chance to escape with Eri and thus render the Shi Hasaikai powerless that way. He could see other applications for her quirk. Dragon's father would be overjoyed to have it. It would restore him to full health in mere seconds, and he tried not to think about that. There was also a possibility it could be used for immortality. Eri didn't seem to be able to use it on herself, but that wasn't an issue. He could copy the quirk and then Again, Yakuni pushed that thought aside. The one thing that would hold the Shi Hasaikai back from absolute power was the fact that they could only generate limited numbers of bullets. They only had Eri, and they couldn't abuse her too much. Kai could take her apart and put her back together, but there were limits on that. He could help them come up with an almost infinite supply of her quirk factor, and he didn't want to think about that. You couldn't grow quirk factor in a lab, at least not like you could grow bacteria cultures. It just didn't work like that, but he could grow clones. With the right facilities, Yakuni could grow 10, 20. As many as they wanted clones of Eri, and they would all have her quirk, and then he ruthlessly suppressed that knowledge. Kai didn't know he could do that, and he had no intention of telling them that. He was good at biology, but that was all. What does it do? Eri asked as she pulled back from the microscope and slid off the chair, allowing him to return. This bit doesn't do anything. It's the factor, he explained, gesturing to the slide. To activate it, you need to have other cells. She frowned. Like a prison? Eri asked softly, almost worried. Yakuni chuckled. The humor surprised her. Not like a prison, he told her. Everyone is made up of cells, he explained. They form every part of us, and what you were looking at is a part of you. He didn't really know how to explain cells to her properly without going back to some very basic biology concepts, and she was only 7. He couldn't remember what he was studying when he was 7, but he was pretty sure it wasn't biology. Do you have them? Eri asked. Not exactly the same, he said, and then thought of a way of showing her. Yakuni reached out for a clean slide and the wafer-thin cover. He scraped that against his skin, showing Eri what he was doing. Then he gestured for her to get back on the chair as he stood. She did, and as she watched, he put a drop of dye on the cells he'd wiped onto the slide before dropping the cover over them. Are you ready? He asked. Eri nodded and put her eye to the microscope as Yakuni slid the new slide under the lens. It's still blue, she commented. That's the dye, he said again. Can you see how the shape of the lines are different? He asked. There were a few moments of silence as Eri looked at his skin cells. They're all joined together, she said. They are, Yakuni agreed, remembering what it would look like. The lines you see are the cell walls, he added. He kind of wished he had an onion. That would really highlight the differences. Maybe he could get one to help educate Eri? Probably. He couldn't see how they'd object to that, and Eri wasn't allergic to them, so he was distracting himself. Nemoto had told him that. Yakuni didn't know what to think. Nemoto had said that some group called the League of Villains was going to come and talk to the Shi Hasaikai, and then he'd changed it to Dragon was coming. He didn't care about some random villain group, he did care about Dragon, which is why he had to do something. There was no way Dragon would bow to Overhaul. Overhaul was inferior in every single way, but he knew how these things worked. If Kai could get leverage, then Yakuni was not going to give him that leverage. Not today. Not ever. And when Dragon came, he'd be proud if he could provide even the smallest bit of aid in taking down the Shi Hasaikai. Kai wanted to rule, but the Yakuza would bow, or he'd be destroyed. That was the way of the underworld, and Yakuni knew which side was going to win. He was on it. Toru moved down the alleyway between 2 warehouses. When she'd started this, she thought it would be a bit easier than it was turning out to be. There were far more warehouses than she thought there were. She'd allowed partially for that, but what she hadn't properly realized that there was not just one warehouse district. There were multiple spread across the city. The obvious ones were near the docks, but there was generally a small area near most industrial areas too, so that had given her more places to search. She could handle that. It was simply going to be a matter of time to search, but what she hadn't factored into her timing was that figuring out what was in a warehouse wasn't as easy as just peeking into it. And some warehouses you couldn't peek into. Those warehouses she had managed to glance into were filled with boxes, and even if she could look in from an open door, or a hole in a wall, she couldn't be sure that the boxes were the real contents. The warehouses were big enough that someone could stack boxes against the walls to ensure no one could look in. Sort of like very, very inefficient curtains. So she was now reduced to actually checking each warehouse. Thankfully, most warehouses had some sort of windows near their roofs. Small windows, but she could walk on the roof safely enough and look in. The only problem with that was that she needed light to see, which meant she had to do it during the day. She couldn't risk being seen with a torch during the night. The weather was okay and the alleyway she was in was not funneling the wind, so it was warm enough, but on the rooftops, she was exposed to everything. Toru was just thankful that the worst of winter was past and they were heading into spring. It might mean more rain, but it was generally warmer, and she had taken to putting a towel in her bag with her clothes. That way she could at least dry off before putting her clothes back on. And, the one good thing with warehouse districts was that generally there were some areas sheltered from the rain in them. She had another few warehouses to check in this district and then she could move on. Toru reached the ladder she preferred to get to the roof and stashed her bag. There weren't usually that many people around, but it wasn't night, so she had to be careful to hide it. Quickly, Toru swarmed up the ladder and ran towards the last group of warehouses she needed to check. Her feet did ping on the roof, but she'd learned to run lightly, so while she couldn't hide the sound of footsteps, they didn't travel far. For a while, she tried to move as quietly as she could, but that had taken too long. She was now going with thought that so long as no one saw anything and she didn't sound like a herd of wildebeest, anyone who was curious would quickly forget hearing her. That was especially true when nothing happened after the noise. In her search she'd found a couple of illicit operations and had given anonymous tip-offs to heroes. She was actually happy about that because while they were anonymous, Toru knew that the HPSC website recorded how she was recording the tips and had no doubt noted her name. She always signed the tips off the same, hidden help. Toru hoped when she finally found Izuku Midoriya, or Tomura Shigaraki or anyone, she could then come forward with the tip and reveal who she was. That would establish a reputation and it should make it easier for her to then get reinstated in a hero course. The particular warehouse she needed to check today had a ridged roofline, with windows lining each of the ridges. It should be easy to see what was inside. She slowed down as she approached the window. No one could see her, but if she made noise as if she was approaching the window and then made more noise going away from it, someone could put 2 and 2 together to get 4. She didn't need anyone having suspicions. Toru wasn't entirely sure what they could do, but she was sure she didn't want to find out. She wasn't stupid. When she found the warehouse she was looking for, Toru knew she wasn't dealing with nicest of people. She crept to the window and peeked in and... What the hell? Toru whispered to herself. Normally, she just expected to see crates stacked on each other, and sometimes manufacturing equipment. There were a couple of crates here and what looked to be cots with messy bedding on them down one end. At the other end of the warehouse there was some tanks which gave her a cold feeling just looking at them. Despite the cold, she felt a stir of triumph. The bedding could just be some immigrants, but there was no one around. The tanks though. Those looked vaguely scientific, and not in a good way. She'd have to get a closer look, but this looked like it could be a lead. If the villains weren't here now, they had been, and that. She would report this to the HSPC, but she wouldn't yet ask for her place back. She'd save that until she found one of the bases they were using, but finding this. Toru grinned. It meant she was on the right track, and that made her far warmer than the cold around her. She was going to be a hero. Just not by the usual route, and that was okay because when people read her history, they'd know she started by helping to bring down some of the worst villains in Japan's history, and that would sound pretty good in a biography. But first, to check. And for that, she had to get in. Shouldn't be too hard. She was far better at using her quirk now than she'd ever been. And really, it was ironic that it was the villains were helping with that, but Toru would take what she could get. When you got expelled from UA, you had to. End. The Emperor's Dragon Part 4, Dragon, Chapters 5 and 6. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe. Join me for the next chapters. Or check out my other works.